Imagine being told that the war you survived, the one they called the war to end all wars, was actually just a warm-up, that the nightmare you endured in the trenches of World War I would pale in comparison to what was coming next. But here's the chilling question. At what exact moment did people realize that World War II had eclipsed the first? Was it when Paris fell in just 6 weeks, faster than anyone thought possible? Was it when entire cities started vanishing in fireballs from the sky? Or was it the moment they opened the gates of Auschwitz and discovered an evil so profound that it redefined human capability for darkness? Today, we're diving into one of history's most haunting realizations, the moment humanity understood that the impossible had happened. A war even more catastrophic than the Great War had consumed the world. And, trust me, the answer isn't what you think. Because while most people assume it was obvious from the start, the truth is far more disturbing. The world sleepwalked into the abyss, and by the time they woke up, 50 million people were already dead. The Great War's shadow. Let's rewind to 1939. If you were alive in September when Germany invaded Poland, you'd have every reason to believe this would be just another European conflict. Terrible, yes, but manageable. After all, you'd survived the last one. The Great War had killed roughly 17 million people between 1914 and 1918. It was called the War to End All Wars, not because people were naive, but because they genuinely couldn't imagine anything worse. The sheer industrial slaughter of trench warfare, the poison gas, the millions of young men fed into meat grinders like the Somme and Verdun. Surely humanity had learned its lesson, right? But here's what's fascinating. In those early months of World War II, most people didn't think they were witnessing the beginning of something bigger. They thought they were watching a repeat, perhaps even a smaller version of the previous conflict. The British called it the Second German War, as if it were just a sequel. Newspaper editorials in London and Paris spoke confidently about containing Hitler, about repeating the victory of 1918. American isolationists pointed to the Great War's futility and insisted that Europe's problems were not America's concern. Again, the disconnect was staggering. While German panzers were pioneering blitzkrieg tactics that would revolutionize warfare, Allied commanders were still thinking in terms of trench lines and static defense. The French had spent billions on the Maginot Line, a massive fortification system designed to prevent the trench warfare of World War I. They were preparing to fight the last war, not the next one. And this miscalculation would cost them everything. The lightning strikes, so when did the first cracks appear in this comfortable delusion? Spring of 1940. That's when everything changed. On May 10, 1940, Germany launched Case Yellow, the invasion of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Military experts on both sides had predicted this campaign would take months, perhaps years. After all, France had the largest army in Europe. Battle-hardened from the Great War, Britain had sent an expeditionary force. The Low Countries would resist. This should have been a grinding, protracted affair. It took 6 weeks. Let me repeat that. Nazi Germany conquered France in 6 weeks. France, the nation that had held the line at Verdun for 10 months in World War I, that had absorbed millions of casualties and still fought on, collapsed in less than 2 months. Paris, the City of Light, fell on June 14th. By June 22nd, France had signed an armistice in the same railway car where Germany had surrendered in 1918. Hitler's deliberately humiliating symmetry. This was the first moment when people truly started to realize something different was happening. The speed was unprecedented. The totality was shocking. In World War I, the Western Front had barely moved for 4 years. In World War II, entire nations were disappearing from the map in weeks. British newspapers that had been confidently predicting victory suddenly turned apocalyptic. The evacuation at Dunkirk, portrayed as a miraculous rescue, was actually a catastrophic military defeat. 330,000 Allied troops had to be evacuated from the beaches, abandoning all their heavy equipment. Britain now stood alone. But even this wasn't enough for everyone to grasp the scale of what was unfolding. The Soviet Union and Germany were still technically allies under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The United States remained neutral. Japan was fighting China, but that seemed like a separate regional conflict. Most Americans thought of it as Europe's problem. A bad one certainly, but not a world war. Not yet. The turning point, Operation Barbarossa, June 22, 1941. This is the date when the illusion finally completely shattered. Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. And the numbers alone should make you pause. 3 million German soldiers, 600,000 vehicles, 750,000 horses, 3,000 tanks, 2,800 aircraft. It was the largest military invasion in human history. The entire Eastern Front stretched over 1,700 miles. By comparison, the Western Front in World War I had been about 450 miles long. But it wasn't just the scale of the invasion that made people realize this was different. It was what came with it. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, followed behind the Wehrmacht, systematically murdering Jews, Soviet commissars, and anyone deemed undesirable by Nazi ideology. This wasn't war as Europeans understood it from 1914-1918. This was something new, a war of annihilation combined with industrialized genocide. The Soviet Union began publishing casualty figures that defied comprehension. In the first 5 months of Barbarossa, the Red Army lost over 3 million soldiers killed, captured, or wounded. 3 million in 5 months. The entire British Empire lost about 1 million total in all of World War I, and this was just the beginning. The siege of Leningrad alone, which began in September 1941, would eventually kill over 1 million civilians through starvation, disease, and bombardment. One city, 1 million dead. By late 1941, people in Allied nations were starting to do the math. If Germany could inflict these kinds of casualties in a single theater of war in just months, then this conflict had already surpassed the Great War in sheer destructive capacity, and it showed no signs of slowing down. Pearl Harbor and true globalization. But here's the moment when it became undeniable. December 7th, 1941. When Japanese aircraft carriers launched their surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, killing over 2,400 Americans and dragging the United States into the war, the conflict finally lived up to its name. It wasn't just a European war anymore. It wasn't even a European war with a side theater in Asia. It was truly global. The Pacific, Southeast Asia, North Africa, the Atlantic, the Eastern Front, the air war over Europe. Fighting was happening simultaneously on 6 continents and every major ocean. Americans who had been reading about the war in Europe with detached concern suddenly found themselves rationing gasoline, sending their sons to training camps, and converting factories to military production. The scale of American mobilization alone dwarfed anything from World War I. By 1943, the United States was producing more aircraft than Germany and Japan combined, more tanks than all Axis powers together. More ships than the rest of the world. The arsenal of democracy was turning economic might into military power on a scale previously unimaginable. And this is where people really started to understand. World War II wasn't just bigger in terms of casualties or geographic scope. It was bigger in its total mobilization of societies. In World War I, soldiers went to the front, while civilians mostly continued their lives with some restrictions. In World War II, entire populations became combatants. Strategic bombing meant that factories and the cities around them became legitimate military targets. Women entered the workforce by the millions, fundamentally changing social structures. Science and technology accelerated at breakneck pace, from radar to penicillin to, ultimately, nuclear weapons. The horror magnified. But if you want to know when people truly grasped that World War II operated on a different moral plane than the Great War, you have to look at 1942 and 1943, when the Holocaust moved into its most deadly phase. The Wannsee Conference in January 1942 formalized the final solution, the systematic murder of all European Jews. What followed was industrialized genocide on a scale that still defies comprehension. Auschwitz, Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec. These weren't just concentration camps like World War I POW camps. These were death factories designed for mass murder with industrial efficiency. At Auschwitz's peak, the Nazis were murdering up to 10,000 people per day. Reports began filtering out through resistance networks and escaped prisoners. The Polish government in exile tried to warn the world, but even when people heard the reports, many couldn't believe them. The human mind simply rejected the possibility. It was too evil, too systematic, too industrial. When Allied soldiers finally liberated the camps in 1945 and saw the evidence with their own eyes, the mass graves, the gas chambers, the skeletal survivors, the psychological impact was profound. General Eisenhower insisted on extensively photographing and documenting everything because, as he said, at some point in the future, people would claim this never happened. World War I had its atrocities: the Armenian genocide, the brutality of trench warfare, civilian suffering under occupation. But World War II introduced something new into human history: genocide as state policy, pursued with industrial methods and bureaucratic efficiency. 6 million Jews murdered, millions more Soviets, Poles, Roma, disabled people, and others deemed undesirable. This wasn't collateral damage from war. This was war's purpose. The Pacific Inferno. While Europe descended into darkness, the Pacific theater was writing its own horrifying chapter. And this is where the scale comparison becomes even more stark. Island-hopping campaigns in the Pacific produced casualty rates that would have been unthinkable in World War I. The Battle of Okinawa alone, fought from April to June 1945 on a single island, killed over 12,000 Americans, over 100,000 Japanese soldiers, and between 40 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians. In 3 months, on one island. The fighting was so intense, so brutal, that American planners looking at invading the Japanese home islands estimated casualties in the millions. The firebombing of Japanese cities introduced a new level of civilian destruction. The Tokyo firebombing of March 9th to 10th, 1945, killed more people in a single night. Estimates range from 80 to 130,000 than the atomic bomb would later kill at Hiroshima initially. 16 square miles of Tokyo simply burned. People boiled in canals where they'd sought refuge. The heat was so intense it created firestorms with their own weather systems. And we haven't even gotten to the atomic bombs yet. The numbers that changed reality: by 1943, military planners and government officials had access to casualty estimates that made the scale undeniable. The Soviets alone had lost more soldiers by mid-1943 than all combatants combined in World War I. And the war wasn't even half over. Let's put some numbers in perspective. World War I killed approximately 17 to 20 million people total, including both military and civilian deaths, over 4 years. By mid-1944, World War II had already exceeded that. By the war's end in 1945, the death toll would reach 50 to 85 million people, depending on how you count. That's not twice as deadly as World War I. It's 3 to 4 times as deadly, but the numbers alone don't capture it. The nature of death had changed. In World War I, most casualties were soldiers who died in combat or from disease in military service. In World War II, civilian deaths exceeded military deaths. Let that sink in. More civilians died than soldiers. Strategic bombing, genocide, famine, mass expulsions, reprisal killings. World War II brought total war to civilian populations in ways that World War I, despite its horrors, had not. The Soviet Union's losses were almost incomprehensible: 27 million dead. That's more than 15% of the entire Soviet population. Every Soviet family lost someone. Many lost everyone. The demographic impact would echo for generations. Some Soviet towns and villages simply ceased to exist. Poland lost 17% of its population. Yugoslavia, over 10%. These aren't just statistics. They represent entire generations wiped out, families erased, futures that would never happen. The technological apocalypse. And then came August 1945, the atomic bomb. When the Enola Gay dropped Little Boy on Hiroshima on August 6th, killing somewhere between 70 and 80,000 people instantly, and when Fat Man destroyed Nagasaki 3 days later, killing another 40 to 70,000, humanity entered a new age. Nuclear weapons didn't just end World War II, they fundamentally changed the nature of warfare itself. This was the final proof that World War II had eclipsed all previous conflicts. World War I's worst weapons, poison gas, artillery, machine guns, were terrible but finite in their destruction. You could survive a gas attack, you could survive artillery if you were in a deep enough trench. But nuclear weapons? There was no defense, no shelter adequate to the threat. A single plane, a single bomb, and an entire city simply vanished in a flash of light, hotter than the surface of the sun. Veterans of the Great War who'd survived mustard gas and Verdun looked at the photographs from Hiroshima and Nagasaki and understood. The world had moved beyond anything they'd experienced. The The shadows burned into walls where people had been standing, the keloid scars that would mark survivors for life, the radiation sickness that killed people weeks after the blast. This wasn't just a bigger bomb, it was a different category of destruction entirely. The aftermath and recognition. When did people realize World War II was bigger than World War I? The answer is gradually, then suddenly, then conclusively. Gradually, as the scale of operations expanded beyond anything the Great War had seen. Suddenly, as specific events, the fall of France, Operation Barbarossa, Pearl Harbor, shattered assumptions. And conclusively, as the full scope of the Holocaust emerged and nuclear weapons redefined human destructive capacity. But here's what's truly haunting. Some people realized it too late. German civilians who'd convinced themselves that Hitler would deliver a quick victory like 1870 against France found themselves in 1945 fleeing the Red Army through the ruins of their cities. Japanese civilians who'd believed the propaganda about inevitable victory watched American B-29s turn their cities to ash. And millions of victims of genocide realized, in their final moments, that the world had descended into a darkness deeper than even the Great War had reached. The soldiers who fought in both wars had perhaps the clearest perspective. They'd experienced the trenches, the gas, the artillery. Then they watched or participated in D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history. They saw strategic bombing flatten cities. They witnessed mechanized warfare on a scale that made World War I look almost quaint. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who'd fought as a young officer in World War I and commanded armies in World War II, later wrote that the two conflicts weren't comparable. They were different categories of human experience entirely. The historical recognition came in waves. Immediately after the war, as the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials documented the full scope of war crimes and genocide in the 1950s and 60s, as historians compiled comprehensive death tolls and analytical studies, and continuing today, as new research reveals just how devastating the war was, particularly in Eastern Europe and China, where casualty figures were suppressed or unknown for decades. The Chinese theater, the forgotten scale. And this brings us to something crucial that often gets overlooked, the China theater. When did people realize the full scale there? China had been at war with Japan since 1937, 2 years before Germany invaded Poland. The Second Sino-Japanese War killed between 15 and 20 million Chinese civilians and soldiers. Events like the rape of Nanking in 1937-38, where Japanese forces murdered between 200,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians and committed mass atrocities, shocked the world even before World War II officially began. But Western attention was focused on Europe. Even today, many people don't fully grasp that China's suffering in World War II exceeded that of any nation except the Soviet Union. The reason? Cultural distance, wartime propaganda that minimized the importance of the Asian theater, and Cold War politics that buried much of this history. It wasn't until decades later that historians fully integrated the Chinese experience into the World War II narrative. The moment of clarity. So if you're looking for a single moment when the world collectively understood that World War II had surpassed the Great War, it probably came in the spring of 1945 as the war in Europe ended, when Allied troops liberated the concentration camps and the world saw the photographs, when the true death toll from the Eastern Front became apparent, when Germany lay in ruins, partitioned by victorious powers, when the maps were redrawn and millions of refugees fled across borders, when the atomic bombs fell on Japan and everyone understood that warfare had fundamentally changed forever. But here's the more disturbing reality. For the people living through it, the realization came too late to change anything. The war's momentum carried it to its apocalyptic conclusion. The machines of destruction, once set in motion, couldn't be stopped until they'd burned themselves out. The refugees fleeing westward from the advancing Red Army in 1945 realized it as they passed through the ruins of cities that no longer existed. The survivors of Auschwitz realized it as they stumbled out of the camps, walking skeletons bearing witness to humanity's capacity for industrialized evil. The citizens of Hiroshima and Nagasaki realized it in a flash of light and a pillar of smoke that rose 7 miles into the sky. The legacy and lessons. Today, we take for granted that World War II was history's deadliest conflict. We know the statistics. see the documentaries, visit the memorials, but put yourself in the shoes of someone in 1939 or even 1941. You'd survived the war to end all wars. You'd been told never again. And now the madness was starting over. At what point would you have realized that this time was different? This time was worse. For some, it was when their city was bombed from the air. For others, when a loved one disappeared into a concentration camp and never returned. For soldiers, perhaps it was storming a beach under withering fire or pushing across the steppes of Russia through mud and blood. For civilians in occupied territories, it might have been watching their neighbors dragged away, their property seized, their world turned into a nightmare. The comparison between the two world wars isn't just about numbers, though the numbers are staggering. It's about the fundamental nature of the conflicts. World War I, for all its horror, maintained some veneer of rules, of civilization. Officers on both sides still recognized codes of conduct, even as they sent millions to die. World War II shattered those illusions. It was existential warfare where entire peoples were targeted for extermination, where civilians became primary targets, where the very concept of war crimes had to be invented because existing frameworks couldn't capture the evil that had been unleashed. The realization that World War II eclipsed World War I wasn't just about recognizing bigger battles or higher casualties. It was recognizing that humanity had descended into a deeper circle of hell than anyone had imagined possible. That the lessons of the Great War hadn't been learned, they'd been forgotten or ignored. That the thin veneer of civilization could be stripped away, revealing an abyss of cruelty and destruction that still haunts us today. Conclusion. So when did people realize World War II was bigger than World War I? The honest answer is, it depended on who you were and where you stood. Strategic planners knew by 1942. The general public knew by 1945. Historians have continued to understand the full scope as more evidence emerged over subsequent decades. But perhaps the better question is, what does this tell us? It tells us that humans are remarkably bad at recognizing the scale of catastrophe as it unfolds. We compare the new to the past, unable to imagine that worse is possible. We normalize the escalation, adjust to the new horrors, and only later look back and ask, how did we let this happen? The people of 1939 couldn't imagine what was coming because nobody could. The speed, the scale, the systematic evil. It was beyond the frame of reference that even the Great War had provided. They thought they'd seen the worst. They were wrong. And that's perhaps the most chilling lesson of all, because it means that our current frame of reference might be just as inadequate for understanding future catastrophes. We look at World War II and think, that was the worst. That can never happen again. But that's what people said after World War I. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And the rhyme scheme of human conflict keeps finding new ways to horrify us. The moment people realized World War II was bigger than World War I was the moment they understood that humanity's capacity for destruction had no obvious limit, that each generation might find new depths to plumb, new horrors to unleash. That realization didn't come all at once in a flash of clarity. It came gradually, like a creeping dread, as the evidence mounted, and the dead were counted, and the ruins smoldered. And even now, 80 years later, we're still grappling with the implications of that realization, still asking how it happened, still wondering if it could happen again, still hoping that this time, finally, we've learned the lesson. Have we? That's a question for you to answer.